The Radical Secular, a video series dedicated to the separation of church and state and the pursuit of justice.
Hello, and welcome back to The Radical Secular. I'm Sean Prophet.
I'm Christophe Difo.
This is our 20th episode. In podcast years, we're almost old enough to drink. So today we are going to go back to our roots, and we're really going to dive deep into what it means to be radically secular. I promise this isn't stuff that you've heard from us before. We're going to talk about not just separation of church and state, but why and how even freedom of religion is best served by a secular approach. We also strenuously believe that a secular approach is essential for democracy, for effective self-government, and the pursuit of justice. But first, we're going to talk to you about America Goes Coup-Coup, and that is C-O-U-P, C-O-U-P. People are freaking the fuck out about what would normally have been a straightforward outcome of a presidential election, with the Republican Party openly embracing the delusion of granting a second presidential term to a man who resoundingly lost both the popular vote and the electoral college. It's crazy. And then we'll check in with Africa for our weekly news and commentary on our mother continent. And then we'll talk about China's heavy-handed moves to suppress democracy in Hong Kong. Terrible news out of Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. And we want to announce that this coming week, Christophe and I are going to be appearing as guests on a related podcast, Blinded by the Light. Before we get into any of that, though, I want to remind you to make sure and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcast. And if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure and hit that red subscribe button. And be sure to give us a 5-star rating on your podcast host if you agree that we deserve 5 stars. And write us a review over at Apple. Positive podcast reviews at Apple will help us grow in their recommendations list faster than almost anything else. And tell your friends and family about our show. Word of mouth really matters.
Email us at theradicalsecular@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram at @radical_secular. Follow us on Twitter at @radicalsecular. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, podcasts at Apple, Google, Spotify, and Stitcher.
All right, let's get into our t-shirts. Today I am wearing a music t-shirt. It says,
"Calm like a bomb." And it's got the bombs coming down from the top. It's got like 2 flat lines on the top. Talk to us about it, Sean.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it's a Rage Against the Machine song, but it just correlates perfectly with my mood this week in terms of the calmness of having Joe Biden having been elected president, but the anxiety that seems to have returned almost immediately after he was declared the winner last Saturday. So,
yeah, man, that's a really great point. I think you did a really good job sort of connecting those two things. It's been a really anxiety provoking week from that perspective, and just sort of a sad week. I'm wearing a shirt today, also a band shirt. Interestingly, we didn't coordinate that, ladies and gentlemen. That is just sort of how it played out. But I'm also wearing my favorite band T-shirt from Bad Religion. Very simple today. I'll show it to you now for the camera.
It says Bad Religion, Age of Unreason, and it has the red circle with a line through it and a cross, which we love that.
Absolutely. A cross buster, man. And, Bad Religion was such an important, I've said this before on the show. I'll say it again. Bad Religion has been one of the most influential bands for me. And not just because it's a great band and I like them, but because they are all about rationality. And just like we're going to be talking about today during the show, Sean, and it's not even about being anti-religion, right? It's about rationality. It's about secularism. It's about not following dogma for dogma's sake. And this particular album is called Age of Unreason. Came out about 1.5 years ago, and I think it's actually one of their best albums ever, which is rare for a band to come out late in their careers. They're around 40 years now, and they are. But the reason why I'm wearing this today specifically is because it feels like, despite that win that we had, we are living in the age of unreason. We are living in an environment where we have an entire political party that is just pretending reality is not reality, and it's terrifying. Yeah.
They're creating their own reality, and this is the problem that you get into if you want to tolerate religion. Religion is diametrically opposed to science, and there's no way to bring them together. And that goes for dogma as well, political dogma. And if you want to create your own reality, religion is one of the best ways to do it. And it seems that there's a lot of overlap between people who are following the cult of Trump and who are following other religious cults. So it's very appropriate.
It's appropriate. And look, I mean, it's like, man, it's the same kind of, they're able to, and this, I guess, is a great way to segue right into the news, I guess. But
yeah, we want to check in on this Coup-Coup election aftermath and just give me your current understanding of what you know, what you're hearing about the legal aspects of this travesty.
For sure. Let's back up for a moment and just think about how earlier this week, liberals were freaking out. And I understand why, right? Because liberals freaked out when Trump was running and everyone said, it's never going to happen. But then it did, right? Mm-hmm. And basically the entire Trump presidency has been a list or a parade of horribles, a parade of things that we thought, as certainly when in the 90s, when we thought that everything was fine, but that we thought could never happen, not in America, but by systematically, step by step, these things have happened. And so I understand why liberals have been nervous about a coup, right? And certainly it's not because Trump wouldn't do it or the GOP wouldn't do it that we're not going to have a coup. That's not the reason. Believe me, if they could, they would. The problem is there's no fucking evidence, right? So there's been 12 cases brought, and they've been laughed out of court. I mean, right? And this is, I think, really interesting, and I think people don't fully grasp this. Is that, let's go back for a second to the impeachment, right? That was not a legal trial. That was a political trial. But when you go and try and, as a matter of election law, go into a courtroom and have to make an argument that there was election fraud, turns out you really need evidence. Even conservative judges, they're judges. Their entire job is to weigh the evidence. If you don't have any, there's nothing to say. So look, so as a matter from that perspective, in terms of sort of pervasive election fraud, we know that's not true. I think the other argument that we hear or concerns that liberals have is, oh, wow, well, what if what if the legislatures go and fuck with the electors, right? And so that's the other argument, right? Like, what if they just appoint electors that are just not going to vote with the people? And the Constitution does say, right, that the electors are connected to the legislatures, right, and that the legislatures get to decide how those electors will vote. But the problem is that, or how those electors should act. The problem is for conservatives is that the law and those states, the states that matter, right, that the legislators have passed laws years and years and years and years and years ago that say, look, the electors have to vote with the popular vote. Right. And so the electors are going to go to Congress and they are bound to vote with and so it would require the point I'm trying to make here is that, yes, it is theoretically possible that this outcome could be overturned, but the hurdles that would have to be overcame to get to that point are astonishingly high, right? It's just the odds are minimal. And like we always talk about on the show, Americans tend not to understand odds, statistics, all that kind of ways of thinking. But this is something that we have a lot of things to worry about as a country. This is not a lot of battles to fight. This is not where we should be spending our concern. This is not where we should be spending our concern.
Right. And it seems that the biggest problem with it is the delay. They're waiting against tradition, against the norm of the transition of a presidency, is that when the election is called, the outgoing president concedes and the incoming president gets the keys to the transition office. And that's not happening. And it's not happening during a time of a pandemic, which means that every day is critical. And contrary to what Trump said, he claimed that, we'd never hear anything about COVID after November 4th. Actually, we're hearing record COVID cases after November 4th. And now we're into exponential growth where just a few days ago it was 100,000 cases. Now we're at 180,000 cases a day.
Insane. It's fucking sane, man.
Insane.
I mean, and again, we talk about things that Americans tend not to understand because of our terrible education system. And that is ideas like exponential growth, right? It's not like it's just I transmit COVID-19 to one person. And then they transfer it to one person. No. They transfer it to 5 people, right? and then
whatever the R value is.
Whatever the R value is, exactly.
Yeah. So this is happening, and it's by all indications, we're going to be looking at hundreds of thousands more deaths by early next year. And I don't think anything can change that now, but I think that there would be yet more hundreds of thousands of deaths that could be prevented if we acted quickly. And that is what is at stake here. And Republicans just don't care. They're either too afraid of Trump, they think somehow there's some political hay to be made by delaying this and dragging it out. And not sure why, because they're really damaging this country. I mean, the thing that really got to me was Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, the foreign minister, America's representative on the world stage, got up there and joked. Or you couldn't tell if he was joking. He seemed just quite pleased with himself when he was asked a question by a reporter, are you going to make a transition to the next administration? He said, yes, there's going to be a second Trump administration, against all knowledge and evidence, and he knows better. So what the fuck?
What the actual fuck, right? And, I was on a motorcycle trip last week when I saw the headline that Mitch McConnell has decided not to say publicly that Joe Biden won the election, right? Mm-hmm. And so when that happened, my immediate thought was, because I know Mitch McConnell, not personally, obviously, thank fucking God, funny thing, I saw this stupid thing on Instagram. As I always say, Instagram is just a bastion of terrible fucking ideas. But I will say, Chelsea Handler was on this sort of like 5-minute clip or something, and she was on this show, and this guy pulled up a poster or whatever of, all right, she's like, and the question was, there was 3 Republican senators. It was Republicans. It was I guess they were all senators. There was Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and Ted Cruz. And the question was, who do you sleep with? Who do you put on a desert island, and who do you marry? And so she had to go through this whole thing of how she could palate sleeping with one of these. She's like, do I get to not look at them when I'm fucking them? Or she's like, I think I would fuck McConnell because I would just beat the shit out of him. It would be like the roughest sexy ever. Anyway.
That's what I saw another one like that along the same lines, and it said, if you think sex is great, how about having sex while beating the shit out of Lindsey Graham? Must have been the same idea.
Yeah, it's the same idea. Yeah, the same basic idea. Fucking great. Chelsea Handler, by the way, she is outstanding. She really is great, and she's super progressive too, and she's very vocal about that. And she's been willing to put her career on the line for progressive issues because she knows she's alienating a huge chunk of the country, and she just doesn't fucking care.
Over and over again, she's done that.
Over and over again. I really respect that about her. Most people are not willing to do that. So of course it also helps that she's already fucking loaded. She has 4 books, right? She has nothing to lose. Whatever. She loses fucking 1 million fans. Who the fuck does she care? Why the fuck does she care? But I guess my point was that McConnell comes out and he says what he says, and he goes on the Senate floor and says, oh, let's just wait until everything's done. But so I was immediately meant to me that there must be some sort of political motive, right? Because he cares about one thing and one thing only: retaining power. That's it. There is no other concern for him, right? He knows Trump lost. He's not a fucking idiot. He knows Trump lost, right?
They all do.
But they all do. But he knows that he wants to keep. He's betting that that if he can continue to keep his base fired up, right, fire it up, that they can win in Georgia. I think that, and
this is also the new birtherism. It's just another conspiracy that the election was not legitimate. He's not really president. He's not really one of us. He's not really an American. Same thing as they did to Barack Obama. And of course, they're going to do it to Barack Obama's handpicked guy, right?
Oh, definitely. And you know what? That's a really great point. And this really just goes to their problem with the Republican brand. And that is that they bet a long time ago on birtherism was just the latest of the lies that they've been telling the American public, and mainly through the Fox News and right-wing media ecosystem. Right. They have a shrinking base. So every election, they have to up the ante. Yeah. Every election, they have to up the ante. And so Trump was just the obvious, Trump was like a better Palin, right? She was like, Palin was really the start of like allowing complete batshittery into their highest levels. And Trump was it's like, when you think of it from that perspective, it's like, well, of course Trump showed up. And of course now they're going to go back to that trough again, Sean. They're going back to that trough again.
Well, they've already gotten us used to the idea that they don't concede races right away. So next time they may really very well, because remember, the Republican Party, they have no shame, but they have to pretend like they have a little bit of shame, like they still believe in American democracy somehow a little bit. Because if they were
a little bit, exactly.
If they were to just ship in a bunch of Republican electors to overturn the will of the people, I mean, I think America would riot. I think it would absolutely riot, but it would also, there would be no more pretense that we actually, I mean, why even bother holding elections at that point?
Exactly. It would just be such a blatant and outright just repudiation of democracy. It's the same reason why it's so hard for them. And they tried it with Obamacare. They thought they had it to do, they had the votes to do it. And they did, in fact, do it with the impeachment trial, right? They just jammed it through and everything like that. So they do it when they think they can get away with it. But you're absolutely right, is that they'd rather kill it with a 1,000 paper cuts, right? Because that happens slowly over time. And as our frog analogy, if you do it slowly, the fake frog analogy, if you do it slowly, it's fine. But if you try and do it all at once, right. Then you can't sell it.
Well, if you look at the refusing to hold a hearing, in the Senate for Merrick Garland, all right, that would have been unheard of in any other administration in our history. It would have been considered obstructionist, and the party doing it would have paid for it at the polls. But what they have done is they have insulated themselves at the polls through gerrymandering, and they felt comfortable enough to go through with this. And so they're also feeling that there's not going to pay a penalty at the polls for this current obstruction of making Biden wait until the last possible minute until he gets the keys to the White House.
I think, that's absolutely right. And the right-wing media ecosystem too is serious, right? Because they know that their base lives in an ecosystem that is impregnable, right? And they have so in that ecosystem, anything that it's like, talk about confirmation bias, right? It is like the ultimate confirmation bias world. So that anything that contradicts that narrative is just fake news, right? That's it. Yeah. And so the Republicans can basically do whatever they want because they all, in terms of their own base. Right. So the combination of not being afraid of your own base, because you don't have to be, because they live in an ecosystem, a media ecosystem. And then two, like you say, gerrymandering protects them from the rest of us.
Yeah. And also you look at their media ecosystem and it's no longer working. Fox News is suddenly, they had to report, they had to call the election. They had to report the votes as they were coming in. They counted the votes and they reported who won the election. And suddenly Fox News is in the doghouse. And so they've got to go even further to the right. They've got to start Trump TV or Newsmax or OANN or whatever it is. They've got their sources lined up who are willing to actually misreport the results of an election.
Which is astonishing that this is where we've gotten, right? This is where they've gotten. And this is where they've dragged America as well. All of us.
Yeah,
it's very depressing, frankly.
And Mike Pompeo would never get away with this if he didn't have the support of the rest of the Republican Party. He's not going to face any consequences. He's not going to ever go on trial. This is treason. He committed treason against the lawfully elected next president of the United States. He sullied our image in the international community, and he's not going to pay for it.
That's absolutely right. And you know what? And that is the long-term damage here, right? So even though the election results are not going to be overturned, right? There are some percentage of Americans, let's just call it 20% of Trump voters, right? That just simply do not believe that that election was legitimate. They don't believe that. They genuinely believe that it was that they're, and this goes to the conspiracy theory issue, right? That you just get to believe whatever you want to believe, right? And that
they're lining up. Alex Jones lining up.
And this has long-term consequences for our democracy when we have a portion of people who just simply, if things don't go their way, they just say it was illegitimate, right? And it's Trumpism 101. I mean, it comes right from the top.
Yeah. And there's also, I think, a reason, because I guarantee Trump knows as well that he lost. He's not stupid. Right. Even though he acts stupid a lot of the time, he is not stupid. He understands power. He knows that he lost. He knows he doesn't have a path to victory. But what he's doing is keeping this fake issue alive so that he can fundraise. And an interesting thing is that on his fundraising letters that he's sending out, there's a little disclaimer at the bottom. And this disclaimer says half of this is going to the RNC and half of this is going to retire my campaign debt. Which is,
unreal. The final grift, final grift. And I think that for the next however many weeks it is before Biden gets the keys, he is going to loot. They're going to loot the government, right? Right. I mean, that is the last play here is loot the treasury and make it as easy for him to profit off of this on the back end. Like there is no other play left. And in the meantime, and a lot of this, I think, is just to assuage his ego, right? So that he can walk out and say it was illegitimate. And not concede that he was a loser, because we know he's never going to concede. We know that's never going to happen. He's not going to go to the inauguration, right? He's not going to do any of the stuff that he's supposed to do. We know that.
No, and he came out like he forgot to dye his hair. He came out in the Rose Garden and he made some ridiculous statement like, well, whoever's the next president, time will tell, kind of thing. So it was his first kind of sort of reality-based assessment of what's going to be happening in January.
Right.
But
yeah.
We'll see what happens.
We'll see. Which is like, I mean, that's the closest Trump gets to saying, like, I might not be president after this, right? And man, terrifying.
It's
terrifying. It's terrifying. It's depressing. I mean, this is the state of the allegedly greatest democracy in the world. This is where we are.
And it's very much like Africa, which we've talked about before. And we're gonna move on to our Africa news segment here. And so we reported a few weeks ago on the Ivory Coast election, and now we're in the post-election where the election was stolen. And if this is from africanews.com, violence erupted in many parts of Ivory Coast after the Constitutional Council officially validated on November 9th the re-election of President Alassane Ouattara for a controversial third term. Now, he's not allowed to have a third term, but he's getting one anyway. This is just too close to home.
It really is.
However, the political unrest in the small landlocked city of Mbato was exacerbated by circulating false information. Mbato fell victim to fictitious gendarmerie reports and press releases about so-called fatalities, as well as misleading and inappropriate images trending online, all of which did not help the already tense political atmosphere. So this underscores one more time what we always talk about, that the fake news and the authoritarianism and the violence all work together. It's a synergistic kind of I don't know if I would call it a plot, but just this is what's happening. This is what's happening all over the world. People with an interest in fomenting violence are using false information, and they're using it to undermine our election here as well.
That's right.
So here's a quote. Abdoulaye Konate, a teacher, outlines what was really happening to contribute to the regional tension. The rumors were such and such shop was burned, so-and-so was killed, so every time one of the parties heard, everyone wanted revenge. It was the rumors themselves that made the situation worse. So, fake news, real violence.
It's absolutely, and in this world, in the way that information has always been power, but now that power is weaponized. It is centralized and also decentralized, right? Because it could be spread so easily now, given the internet.
Any actor has the power that only a news organization used to have. So
that's right.
You've got all this chaos. People are fomenting narratives and counter narratives that basically serve whatever agenda they're looking to promote at the time, and they don't, damn the torpedoes.
Exactly.
So, all right, moving on. In Ghana, the former president Jerry Rawlings has died. Musa Faki Mohammed, chairperson of the African Union Commission, said, quote, "Africa has lost a stalwart of Pan-Africanism and a charismatic continental statesman. My sincere condolences to his family, the people, and the government of Ghana." Now, I have an interesting story about Ghana. As I've talked about before, my parents were missionaries, and they spent a lot of time in Ghana and Nigeria. And so I was there in Ghana in 1978, and I met the head of state there, General Achampong, who preceded Jerry Rawlings as president. Achampong was deposed by Rawlings and executed by firing squad along with 7 other members of his government. After this bloody coup, though, Rawlings went on to oversee Ghana's transition to multi-party democracy, winning a democratic election in 1992 and 1996 before stepping down in 2001. So he got in power by shooting everybody, but then turned out to be a Democrat. Who knew?
Yeah, who knew? Wow. Okay. Interesting combination of things, Wow.
It is. And so not only did I meet the deposed General Achampong, but I also met 2 of the other generals who were executed. This is a crazy story. I mean, this is just nuts.
Wild.
It was General Coty and General Akufo, and we had dinner with all of them at General Coty's house. I remember this like it was yesterday. I was like 13.
So crazy, so crazy. It's so wild that you have to have these sort of connections with these like historic moments, right? Like, wow,
Yeah, well, that's why when I heard Jerry Rawlings died, I'm like, wait a minute, I know that name. And then the whole story comes flooding back because this is a long time ago.
Sure. Wow.
But the other interesting, weird thing about this is that General Coty had been a world famous athlete. He held the world record at one point, having high jumped 2 meters at the British Commonwealth Games in 1958. So what a world, man.
Strange world. Like, all right, also like this sort of like a star athlete, democratically, just a really just strange confluence of events. Strange.
Yeah. So, but anyway, we send our condolences to the people of Ghana because they did lose a statesman who helped them overthrow the legacy of colonialism and transition from military dictatorship to modern multi-party democracy. So we love that.
We sure do. We love democracy here on the Radical Secular. We fucking love it.
Yeah. And another little piece of good news, in Mali, there has been a success in an anti-jihadist operation. Troops from the French-led Barkhane Force military operation killed Ba'ag Musa, described as the military commander of the Al-Qaeda-aligned group to support Islam and Muslims, or GSIM, in the Malian desert. Musa had been on a United Nations sanctions list and was believed responsible for numerous jihadist terrorist attacks on Malian and international ally forces in the region. Friday's announcement marks the conclusion to an operation launched Tuesday in a series of anti-jihadist actions taken in recent weeks. France has thousands of troops in West Africa to help fight jihadists around the area. The ousting of Islamist extremist groups from power in Mali by way of a military operation in 2013 saw a regrouping of jihadist forces in the desert who have since wreaked terror and havoc in the region. So,
a good outcome.
Yeah, and we love France because France is officially secular. They are one of the most secular nations in the world, and we love that they're fighting jihadist terrorism.
Fucking love it. Because it's so important, right? Because we always talk about how dogma and how and really bad religious thinking and hierarchy leads to real events, real problems, right? It's not like these things don't just happen in the abstract. We don't sit here and just rail against hierarchy for no reason, right? We don't rail against these bad ideas for no reason. They're real people out there that are dying, right? In the United States, it's not that same level of violence, but the idea, the jihadist movements, various jihadist movements, are a direct descendant and corollary and outcome connected to religious thinking and to that kind of dogmatic outlook on the world.
No, there's not a day that goes by. You just read the headlines every single day. You can trace a direct line right back from a lot of the things that are happening right to religion, right to dogma. And that doesn't have to be, by the way, Christianity or Islam. It can be bullshit Republican dogma. I mean,
exactly. It's right, because that's such an important point, Sean, because it's not really the brand that matters, right? It doesn't matter if it's Republican dogma. In fact, it doesn't even matter if it's liberal dogma, for that matter, right? Like if you talk about, right, if you're talking about like the sort of left wing radical socialist type perspective, any perspective that just is closed off to reason and facts, right? That's the point. That doesn't deal in reality.
And it's not because it's socialism. It's just because a lot of these guys who are on the hard left just don't deal in facts.
Exactly.
And there's a factual case for socialism.
Absolutely, there is. Absolutely, and that's an argument that we could make on this show, and I think we probably do make on this show.
Yeah. It's just that a lot of people go about it in the wrong way, and they use their dogma to, and either way, whether it's coming from any side, it is blocking the real solutions that can help people and save lives.
Exactly.
And so that wraps up Africa. Let's move on to Hong Kong, where democracy has received yet another setback. According to CNN, Hong Kong's pro-democracy lawmakers said Wednesday that they would resign en masse to protest Beijing's growing control over the local legislature. It's one of the last remaining centers of dissent in the Chinese city. There were 15 resignations, and they were set off by a decision earlier in the day out of Beijing that forced the removal of 4 opposition lawmakers from that Hong Kong legislature. This would have allowed the remaining pro-democracy legislators to be impeached at the will of the majority. So they resigned rather than letting themselves be forced out. So essentially, it's just a major retrenchment for democracy in Hong Kong, which had previously been guaranteed to continue through at least 2047 under the One Country, Two Systems agreement signed between the United Kingdom and the government of Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s. Hong Kong was supposed to remain a special administrative region, not subject to the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. This agreement now seems to have come to a premature end. So it's just heartbreaking.
It really is, man. Like, and again, we always talk about this stuff, and it's so easy to talk about it. And this is why I think it's so important that we do the Africa segment, because we always talk about these sort of ideas as if it's easy to think about these things as abstract but there are real people there, right? There are real human beings that are living, whose democracy and freedoms are being systematically taken away. And the other part of the story, which is super important, is that when is that power corrupts, and it is never enough. It's never ever enough, right? Maybe for China, it can be Tibet, right? It can be Hong Kong, but no matter what it is, right? They are expansionists, right? It is like that kind of authoritarianism is almost by definition expansionist, or Russia, right? And the Crimea, right? And on and on and on.
And I think it's a media thing too, because you've got this place, Hong Kong, that's a part of China now. And so there's reporting that's going on. Other Chinese are looking very closely at what's going on, and they're seeing that there was this dissent and there were these demonstrations, and they were being allowed to happen because the law allows free expression. And so that became a real problem for the Chinese Communist Party, who didn't want copycat demonstrations just popping off all over China, because there's a lot of things going on that people could be protesting right now. I mean, China is not a fun place to live.
No, it's not. I mean, there's so many reasons why it's not a fun place to live. And that is such I'm glad you made that point too, because right? It's a challenge to their power. It's a threat to their power. Any kind of demonstration is a threat to their power. And because of the democratization of media, and because these demonstrations will be seen in China, right? No matter how much they try and crack down on it, it will be seen in China. And the last thing they want are those kinds of ideas spreading around Chinese citizens, right? And that's the last thing they want.
They're not even allowed to observe the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. They can't even talk about it. So if you can see, this is how scared they are of any real, true democratic movement taking hold. So they had to do this. And the worst part about this is now under the Trump administration, the U.S. used to intervene in these types of situations.
Right. Yep.
And Donald Trump is he's this America First guy, which also makes him an isolationist. And
so true.
So it makes him and a lot of Republican senators have been very upset about what's been going on in Hong Kong. But again, they're all enthralled to Trump at this point. They can't really, there's not going to be a resolution. There's not going to be, the State Department's not going to say anything. The president's not going to condemn it. So, it's now the way it is.
They're afraid of their base, they're afraid of their base, and they care more about their jobs than they care about America. And the base has been radicalized. They've been radicalized by the likes of Fox News and used to be. It's crazy we're talking about that. Fox News is now reasonable relative to it's not relative to the complete batshittery on coming out of the right.
It is. It's actually a widening of the rift that was already there in Fox between the opinion hosts at night and the normal news coverage during the day, because the normal news division has been pretty good. Their polling has always been good. They had Shep Smith. They have other anchors who are pretty decent. And Shep Smith is obviously gone now. I don't know who's on because I don't watch it, but I think they've got some good guys on there. Brett Baer, I think.
Yeah, right. And then you have their primetime lineup that is just like unreal and just completely unhinged.
It's like I can't even describe it. They're not different qualitatively from Alex Jones.
Exactly right.
They're just better produced.
They're better produced with a wider audience and with almost more dangerous, because there's sort of this veneer of news of legitimacy that Alex Jones, when you go to Alex Jones, you've already you are already at a place that you are willing to accept a lot of things that most Americans are not willing to accept. But you can be my dad, for example, right, and be a conservative guy and be like, oh yeah, no, he used to love Bill O'Reilly, and just be like, Bill O'Reilly, and Bill O'Reilly is sitting there telling things that are not true, but it sounds, there's just this veneer of decency and all that, and that's what I think, which is really what's really really dangerous.
Yeah, and it's just every day, millions of people are tuning into this stuff, and you can't run a democracy like that. And so,
exactly
where we end up is where Hong Kong eventually is ending up. When you start,
exactly,
it's just we're a little ways from there, thankfully, but it's not that far. It's not that far. There, we talked about earlier. Once you're getting this close to delegitimizing an actual election, pretty soon they won't even hold them.
Exactly.
All right, well, that wraps up our news segment for the day, and I want to talk briefly about the Blinded by the Light podcast, which is something that we're going to be doing a guest appearance on this coming week. And the host of that podcast, his name is Bayard Lewis, and he is the son of so-called messenger David Lewis, who is the leader of the group Heart Center, another Ascended Master cult. Now, we've talked about our cult background, and this is why we're going on the show, because both of us grew up in this Church Universal and Triumphant / Summit Lighthouse organization. And Heart Center, which was started by Bayard Lewis's father, is an offshoot of that. So anyway, that's the relevance. We think this is going to be a relevant show for the Radical Secular, because we're going to get a chance to talk in detail about our experiences of how we got out of this cult. And also we're going to be dark on Thanksgiving, because we're both going to be having Thanksgiving, a socially distanced Thanksgiving with our families. And so we will hopefully be able to bring you that special episode. So what are your thoughts? Are you excited about this?
Oh, I'm totally excited about it, man. I mean, I think Bayard is a really smart guy. I've enjoyed the podcast. I think, and I'm just really excited that somebody's doing this, because this is an important story to tell. It dovetails very well with the sort of things that we talk about here on the Radical Secular. In particular, in terms of the failure of reason and clear science-based or reason-based thinking. And so I'm excited, man. I'm really excited, and I hope we can partner with Bayard on various projects in the future.
I hope so too. And I mean, he's got some chops. I listened to his first podcast, and it was well put together. And I just think that there's some good room for collaboration. And I want to encourage any of our listeners to check out the Blinded by the Light podcast, because I think it's going to be. He's only had 1 or 2 episodes so far, and I think it's going to be getting better and better as time goes on.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, that's it for the show announcements, and we are now going to move on to our main segment, which this is going to be a juicy one, folks. This is about being radically secular. We're essentially kind of going back to our reason for being. We say this at the end of every episode, but we really need to clarify and elaborate, because we get some people asking us on our various social media feeds, was being radically secular all about? And we live and breathe this stuff. So, but we really need to kind of reiterate and have sort of a go-to segment that we can direct people to say, this is what we're about. So grab some coffee or an adult beverage, settle in, and we're going to get into this. All right. So why did we choose this name for our program? What does it mean to be radically secular? Let's review. The general difficulty with talking about secularism is, like atheism, secularism can be seen as a negation rather than a positive position. So I'm going to really put the meat on the bones here of what we stand for, why we believe this is decidedly not the case. We think that secularism is hugely positive, and it's something that's really necessary for all human progress. Necessary.
Absolutely. And if people understood what secularism is and really understood it, and this is why I think it's so important that we're doing this, Sean, is because it's basically saying everybody should be able to do what they want. Right? So, I mean, and so I think a lot of times people confuse secularism and atheism, and I think so I think that this is going to be a really good show for us to sort of parse that out.
Yeah, and I mean, it really, secularism, it's strictly separation of church and state, but it's just not that simple, okay? Because a lot of people don't really appreciate what that means, and it means taking a real hands-off approach. The government taking a hands-off approach, but, and this is key, this is different from libertarianism, the government is sort of adjudicating and making sure that none of these groups that are sort of vying for dominance are getting the upper hand. And so not in law, not in culture, all of those things. It's taking the hands-off position, but it's also being a regulator. And so, and in order to really see how that plays out in a democratic society, we have to understand how that coexists with freedom of religion. And freedom of religion it's really important. And obviously we don't like religion all that much, but it's still very important that people be free to worship as they choose. And so this is kind of a key point of secularism, is really to protect these groups from becoming too dominant. All right. For each other, because they could be a danger to each other as well as to non-believers.
Yes. And I, and they will be, right? It's not even that they might, it's that they will be, because, right, the nature of any one religion, or really any one sect, whether that be whatever that sect may be, right? The religion is almost beside the point. The point is like any kind of movement in that way, and frankly, life, to really break it down, life generally, it's driven to exist at the expense of others. And so you need to be able to level that playing field.
Yeah. And so when you talk about a multicultural society, which is increasingly every place in the world, because we're all mixing and we're all moving around the world, the enemy really is sectarianism. Exactly. That's what you're up against.
Exactly.
So let's look at what has happened with the opposite of secularism, which is theocracy.
We hate theocracy.
We fucking hate
it.
Theocracy. Theocracy is the melding of church and state to the point where the human leaders take on the authority and the role of gods or govern in the name of God, or they pretend to base their laws on the laws of God. And this is often referred to as so-called natural law. You'll hear conservatives talk about this all the time. And of course, in Muslim countries, you'll hear them talk about Sharia law, which is from the Quran. And that is literally the basis, constitutionally the basis of their law. So it's a problem.
Terrifying.
And so we've touched on this in some of our earlier episodes. Our working assumption here at the Radical Secular is that the concept of God is at best incoherent and at worst deceptive. Humans throughout their history have believed in thousands of different gods. We can simply say that they're, we don't want to get into the weeds, the philosophical weeds of arguments for and against belief in gods. We could do that. I mean, I'd love to do that, but not this episode.
Not this episode. Yeah.
We can simply say that there doesn't seem to be any good scientific evidence for the existence of any gods. We also know that we can't prove they don't or have never existed in the past. They could have. So negative proof is impossible. But our thing is, we assert that humans in general have no way of knowing anything about any gods that may or may not have existed or exist now.
Exactly.
So any claims by human leadership of divine sponsorship are just deception. They're spurious, they're false, they lend themselves to abusing the concept of legendary or mythical deities to amplify their own claims to power. And when human leaders claim divine mandates in this way, their citizens become subjects, leaders become kings. They're claiming a divine right not only for themselves, but their entire lineage. Gods, therefore, create earthly dynasties. And this was the divine right of kings that allowed generations of rulers throughout human history to appoint their offspring as successors and avoid accountability. So,
and accountability is something that is we talk about that all the time here, and it is so important, right? And this also sort of harks back to human nature, and that is, human beings act in selfish ways without accountability, right? Okay, we act in selfish ways no matter what, but our behavior can sort of be constrained by accountability, and that's why it's so critical. And whenever we see lack of accountability is directly connected to any atrocity that we see on a personal level, on an individual level, on a large scale level, historically, today, always. It's always an unaccountable leader that is at the core of that.
Yeah, and who's more unaccountable than somebody who's invisible, right?
Exactly.
So we have to go back into prehistory to understand how this all got started. And what we know about hunter-gatherer society is that people worshipped at that time primitive nature gods, and there were all kinds of them. There were patriarchal, matriarchal. There were sun gods and volcano gods and lightning gods and earthquake gods and rain gods and all of these things that people were dependent for their survival. So they would pray to these imaginary gods to make it rain or make it stop raining or make the volcano stop erupting or whatever it is. They'd sacrifice people to those gods. So these primitive nature gods, people would use them as surrogates for these forces they didn't understand. And as civilization developed further, things became more structured. And we founded agriculture and larger cities. And anthropologists have noted that above a threshold of larger populations, such as 1 million, people began to believe in angrier gods. And they were very interested in interfering in human affairs, and they were also sponsoring whoever the human leaders were. So a working theory is that in a Darwinian sense, it may have been necessary for humans to create gods and religion in order for rulers to manage the population, to create rituals and structures of worship and build temples and statues to focus the attention and loyalty of the people. Makes sense, right?
Yeah. And I think, right. And that makes a lot of sense. And also in terms of, just generally running when you don't have, we have today written laws, we have meticulously thought out, laws and structures and norms. And when you don't have that, it certainly seems that that religion sort of evolved as that kind of structure, both from a powerful person trying to, perhaps nefariously control other people, but also, just like you say, to run a society. But like when there isn't some sort of obvious structure there, religion provides that structure.
Yeah, and I don't know if you remember the Star Trek episode, but there was a Star Trek episode where there was a woman who she had some kind of technology that she was using to create earthquakes on a planet.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, right? And
I do remember that.
So by pretending to control these earthquakes, she was pretending to be a god, but it was really that she just had some kind of a transporter technology that could cause the plates to shift and cause an earthquake. So she kept this entire civilization, and she was somehow immortal. I don't remember the exact plot of the story, but she was somehow immortal, and she kept this civilization like enslaved to her for 1,000 years. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And we're going to talk more about this, but that's absolutely right. And somebody might argue that, hey, well, look, if it's doing good, then this is a lot of the arguments for religion in general. It's like, oh, it gives value to people in their lives, so why not use it? It's done right. It's done these X, Y, and Z good things, but the problem, of course, with that is that like it's just because it's done that in the past, even if it has done that in the past, it doesn't follow that it's the best way to do that. Well, in an evolutionary sense, what happened is that societies, cultures, cities, whatever, in this time period in human history, who developed a strong religious bond were able to cooperate better. They were able to build faster. They were able to have more dedicated armies, and so they had an evolutionary advantage. For sure, I think a lot of historians have realized this and figured this out. That it was something that we just couldn't. There's no way around it. And in fact, a lot of these religions that existed, for example, in the book Homo Deus, the historian Yuval Noah Harari, he talks about the ancient temples being a lot like modern corporations in the sense.
Fascinating.
They were the focus of trade and labor, and where people all bring their food to the temple and other products to market. And even branding, there was even branding that was going on back there. So if you were a member of one temple, that might be like working for Apple, and if you were a member of another temple, you might be working for Microsoft. There'd be this rivalry between these temples to have a better product. So even the modern corporate structure sort of goes back to ancient religion. It's fascinating. It's a great book.
It really is fascinating. I've not read that one. I'll have to, and I think. It's really interesting, right? Because in small rural communities now in the United States, right, the church is not just a church, right? It's a center of social everything. Everything, right? That's where you go to. They sponsor dances, and right, that's where you go on Sunday to see your friends, and so it ends up becoming much more than just a religion. It's a structure, and one of the struggles we're going to fight. We're going to we as a culture, as a society, find ourselves facing in the future as these sort of structures begin to dissolve. What is the glue that holds everyone together? And I think that's a lot of what secularism can be.
Yes, and there are many positive aspects of secularism and
we'll talk about that down the road. But yeah,
we will. Yeah, but getting back to theocratic governance, the common thread in our recorded history is that the center of power becomes invisible and unaccountable. If any god throughout history were supposedly ruling a given civilization, the only communication with that god was through a human representative, such as in Egypt, it was Pharaoh Akhenaten. He was the supposed earthly representative of the sun god Aton. But the only way to see or get to Aton was through the pharaoh or a statue of the god built by humans. And the only way that god could enforce the law was through the actions of humans, which were nearly at that time always violent and authoritarian. And there was slavery and there was all this oppression. So, but when you think about it logically, for being all powerful, it's pretty humiliating for any god to have to use ordinary humans to accomplish anything.
Right. Why? If are you all powerful or are you not? Right.
It just like, yeah, why do they have slaves build the pyramids if Aton could have just come down and put the blocks in place himself?
Right.
You know, if
like, Pharaoh's literally God, why not just point? Right. Come on.
Yeah. So it's interesting, and it isn't what it seems. I mean, it's not about the invisible guy in the sky. It's about humanity and a human cultural organization. So we understand that the representatives of gods have not behaved very well. They've behaved exactly as humans would behave if gods didn't exist, but with a lot of extra authority. So this is why we at the Radical Secular believe that theocracy is the height of human immorality. It is always and without exception the use of false imaginary beings to extend the dominance of a ruler and a ruling class and a social hierarchy, usually with wealthy, powerful men at the top.
Every damn time, man. Every damn time. I mean, I'm sure there are some matriarchal societies out there that were using power the same way, but certainly in modern times, every single fucking time, it is some man, powerful man, and in the West, a powerful white man sitting on top of a hierarchy. And claiming either quasi deity status or actual deity status, and of course, the Muslim world is rife with this problem as well.
Yeah, I mean, and it really has nothing to do with God. It's just that the gods are a placeholder. It's the imposition of an unearned and unjustifiable human hierarchy through pretense.
Absolutely. And like you say, you know, in democracy, and even in democracy, right, we see this all the time, and it doesn't have to be religious, right? The Republican Party is the obvious example of this. And we see this all the time. I mean, even within the corporate structure, right? I mean, you see this kind of, and different corporations operate differently. I'm lucky to work for a really, really great corporation that's relatively flat, but that is not the norm, right? And when you go into, certainly like I've also worked in law firms, and I can tell you that is as dogmatic a structure and rigid structure where people at the top are revered as essentially as gods. And in that context, Sean, they are gods, right? They can end your livelihood like that.
Stroke of a pen. And that's why Harari, that's why I really recommend Yuval Noah Harari's book, Homo Deus. I mean, he really nailed it when he talked about the early temples being corporations. That light bulbs just went on all over the place for me on that one. And it would take a lot longer than an hour episode to trace this whole evolution of the modern secular state from these early religions. And maybe we could do that another time. It'd be fun. But Harari, he traces this development by classifying pretty much every human cultural paradigm or governing philosophy as a religion, including modern forms of humanism, which he claims are actually a response to industrialization. And he considers both capitalism and communism to be expressions of humanism. Now, I'm not completely sure that I agree with his characterization of humanism as a religion. And, you know, I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. And this is something that gets thrown at humanists and atheists and frankly, progressives from the right all the time. And it might just be that they can't understand ideas without thinking of them in terms of religion, right? And maybe that's just a worldview problem, but it's disingenuous at best, right? I mean, we are not, there is no dogma here other than, like, you know, observable reality and facts.
Yeah, and so that's something that if you're used to dealing with received wisdom, whether it's from your CEO or whether it's from a book, that received wisdom cannot be questioned, and it's sort of the antithesis of a systems-based approach where everyone's accountable. So, and Harari actually takes this a little bit forward, and he talks about the next post-humanist religion, which is coming along, and he calls that dataism. And essentially, dataism is a religion that just values the higher and higher rates of data, copying data, saving data, and essentially boiling down what human beings are into data. And he this is a really great section in this book that really, again, opened my mind. And he uses this to break down the idea of human free will, because our apps and our data centers know more about us than we potentially know about ourselves. They might be able to make better decisions for us in terms of what we should do for a living, who we should marry, all of these things, because they literally know more about us than we know about ourselves. And so it's a kind of mind-bending, maybe even scary thing that he's talking about, because how does democracy survive in the absence of human free will? And the answer he comes up with is it may not. So
wow, yeah, that's really interesting, and we really do need to do an episode on free will, or at least a segment on free will, because we keep coming back to this point, and it's so critical because we can't really do it really does start to bring in questions about democracy, and even ideas like accountability, right? Mm-hmm. Like it starts raising questions. As a practical matter, at the end of the day, we still need a democracy. We still need laws and everything like that. But still, it does broach the question. What you just said also reminded me of the social network, right? Because I think there is a really strong force coming out of Silicon Valley of this idea of like the future is in data, right? And frankly, it does feel kind of religious, not a religion. That's too much, I think. But
the algorithm is the new God in a way.
There you go.
And in the sense of replacing this received wisdom about ourselves.
Yes.
The algorithm knows us better than we do, and than we know ourselves. And so again, we're seeing this in terms of bad data. What's happening to our election right now? We are being inundated with bad data. And remember, dataism is agnostic. It doesn't care what the data is. It just says, make more of it.
Sure. Great point. Yeah, it's, I mean, it's, again, it feels a little dystopian in some ways. The idea of losing control is always scary to we human beings. But look, I mean, well, the bottom line is I got to read this book. Everybody's got to read this fucking book.
No, it's a great book. And it also, there's the potential there, though, that we could make that AIs and using massive amounts of data that are being collected could make better decisions than we can. And that's something that provides some hope. But again, this is, how do you keep it accountable? How do you keep this power from just concentrating even further? And so, all right, well, I don't want to beat that horse anymore. Read the book. And we still have to go back to talk about why secularism is important to preserve what remains of democracy, and clearly, religion is an important human universal. You can't beat religion out of people, as we know from what happened under Soviet totalitarian communism and what's still happening under Chinese communism. I mean, throwing religious people in labor camps is horrific. So we have to, clearly, free and democratic citizens have to be free to worship as they choose. And no matter what we may think about religion, no matter how much we might dislike it, we're non-believers. It's not for us, but we understand that it's valuable to many people. And the most important point here is that if you value religion and it's practiced as a social good, you should be radically secular.
Yes. And you know what's so funny is that concept, and by the way, we're definitely going to use that as a quote in sort of the as a promo later on, because that quote, that line is so true, and it's so what we're about, because it's both of us probably have reputations on social media, et cetera, for being atheists, and we are, and think that that's the best way. But nevertheless, we are also humanists, and we think that, look, you should be able to practice your life and live your life as you'd like to, as long as you're not hurting other people. And that last part is really critical in terms of religion, right? And that's when you get into ideas of like this batshit like religious liberty sort of thing, right? Which is like, I should have liberty to impose my views on other people. Now that's where we have to draw the line. That's the important line.
We're going to talk about that coming up here. But first, I just want to talk about how religious freedom is really being killed, and that is by various theocracies. And this is from a Pew study that was published just last week on November 10th. Authoritarian governments are getting more and more likely to restrict religion. And of course, we know that many authoritarian governments are themselves religious theocracies. And this article from Pew it begins in 2018, the global median level of government restrictions on religion, that is, laws, policies, and actions by officials that impinge on religious beliefs and practices, continued to climb, reaching an all-time high since Pew Research Center began tracking these trends in 2007. And we're going to put this article in the show notes because it is an extensive study on this and documenting the kinds of abuses that have been going on in other countries and frankly in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's I think there's something counterintuitive about the idea that a religious theocracy would, at least in the minds of many people, would restrict religion. But to be clear, they don't restrict the religion they
they make it mandatory.
They make it mandatory, in fact, right? You can't have any other religion. That's the problem, And we, like you say, that's what I say. You should be radically secular if you're a religious person, and especially if you're a member of a religion that's in the minority in a country, right? Let's say you are a Muslim in the United States. You should really love radical secularism because it's going to allow you to do your religion, and live according to those principles as long as we're going to talk about later, as long as you don't hurt other people.
Yeah, and it increases when you are secular. It increases support by flattening hierarchy, support for racial and economic justice, and it does not allow. It holds religious hierarchies accountable, so that no one is able to claim special privileges, and that in turn gives maximum freedom of conscience to the individual, whether that person is a believer in any of the thousands of the world's religions or a non-believer in any religion. And so we have to go back to the First Amendment, which we know and love.
Yep.
And the most salient part of that for secularism is the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, which reads, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Why don't you comment on that one?
Yeah, and like this is about as basic as it gets, man. And it's the very first, right? It's in the very First Amendment, and this was the promise of the United States, right? I mean, in connection with, of course, the prohibition of the sort of free exercise clause, right? So, right, people that came to the United States, right? In the beginning, they wanted to be able to do, but to practice what they want to practice, and I think this really highlights an interesting juxtaposition between the "we are patriots" crowd and but we're also the Christians crowd, right? Because and we believe in the Constitution, and all of these people that are like are the Second Amendment crowd, and all the people who are like, oh, we vaunt the Constitution, we love this thing, except we believe that this is a Christian nation, right? And look, from a legal perspective, I am deeply concerned. We're going to talk a little bit. I think we're going to talk a little bit about Samuel Alito later on. Right?
Yeah. Oh my God,
Alito, and the fact that we hear this coming from the Supreme Court, the idea, this whole religious freedom argument. And look, I haven't looked into the sort of jurisprudence of this, but this is the real damage that these conservative judges are doing. This idea of that it's a back door around the 14th Amendment. It's a back door around discrimination laws, right? As an end run around the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. And that's, from my perspective, I think that's what's most terrifying.
Yeah, and so this comes down to the basic divide between liberals and conservatives is that liberals tend to focus on the Establishment Clause and conservatives focus on the Free Exercise Clause. And in fact, they got so concerned back in the 90s that there was this law that it actually passed the Senate like 97-3 or something like that. And it was signed, I believe, by Bill Clinton, I think. It was called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And it attempted to carve out exceptions for people in the law from following civil rights law. And it was because they snuck it through as Religious Freedom Restoration Act, it got almost universal bipartisan support. And that's just really dangerous. And we're seeing now another level of this where we're actually having Supreme Court justices who are in the majority, who are actively talking about granting religious privilege in the law. And so we're going to get into that. I want to talk about what kind of structures, philosophical and legal structures, might make a difference to keeping the United States secular. And we see that many of the nations of the European Union, like, as I mentioned earlier, France, they have better protections than we do in terms of official secularism. They don't have a free exercise clause like that. And so you'll come to understand as we talk about this how pervasive the influence of America's dominant religion of Christianity has become. In fact, under the steady erosion of the Establishment Clause, Christianity has become nothing short of America's official state religion, and it's becoming more so every day. These days, and since the so-called moral majority became a political force in the 1980s, you can be sure that if the Republican Party is backing some policy, it will be hostile to secularism, and it will grant new privileges to religion. And there have been any number of conservative books railing against secular progressives, which is what we are. We
Absolutely.
are in their crosshairs. And Bill O'Reilly wrote this book called Culture Warrior, and I believe he's the one who coined this sort of demonization of secular progressives in 2006. And, you know, they do kind of have good reason to fear us, because if we were in charge, we would make it very difficult for them to carve out these exceptions in the law. And looking a little closer at what they've done, the Christian nationalists have established a sort of moral hierarchy that uses religion as an underpinning to justify every other type of social and economic hierarchy, mostly unearned and mostly unaccountable. And it's not something that's entirely explicitly spelled out in the Bible, although there is some of that. Certainly, men above women is something that's in the Bible, and there's slavery and what else is in there in terms of hierarchy?
I can't even think of anything off the top of my head, but there's so many. I mean, even animals in some ways are like, right? Like, and like humans above animals, right? And that's a really interesting sort of thing that we get into at some point in the future as well. This idea that they're like that humans have dominion over animals. It's always about having dominion over something else, right? That's always the rub, always the rub.
And of course, the Ten Commandments, thou shalt have no other gods before me, right? And then
that's the ultimate authority, right? And sort of everything else, and that's what we're talking about here, right? Everything else is modeled off of that concept, that structure.
Yes, and adults over children, honor thy father and thy mother, right? So anyway, Christians are literally swimming in these hierarchical metaphors that they live by, and they express it in all of their social and cultural interactions. And this linguist named George Lakoff, he actually really, really nailed it, and he came up with this conservative moral hierarchy that he wrote in an article, and this just nails it. If you think about it, you think about everything the Republican Party stands for, and it's going to be what I'm about to read. God above man, man above nature, the disciplined or the strong above the undisciplined or the weak, the rich above the poor, employers above employees, adults above children, Western culture over other cultures. That is right down the center of the Republican Party.
Absolutely.
America above other countries. America first, Donald Trump. Men above women, whites above non-whites, Christians above non-Christians, straights above gays, and gays above transgender.
That's it. I mean, right? I mean, that is the entire Republican Party. That is, and not even just the Republican Party, Sean, it is conservatism. That is conservatism, right? I mean, we can talk about it however we want, right? You can call it conservatism, you can call it Trumpism, you can call it religion, but the bottom line is it's that exact structure. And if any honest conservative, oxymoron, any honest conservative would look at that, they'd say, yeah, that looks about right. Because,
we believe all of those things, but we're not racist and we're not sexist.
Oh yeah, exactly. Right. Right. That is the cherry on top. But no. We're not homophobic. We're not racist. We're not sexist. We just believe that gays belong on the bottom of the bottom. Lower down. We just think that gay people don't deserve the same human rights as we do. But doesn't mean we're homophobic. No. Of course not.
Yeah,
God forbid we connect our ideas with their consequences.
Can't do it. Can't do it. And their actions betray them in all of these things. And so this is the justification they have for slavery, colonialism, capitalism, systemic racism, all of it. The whole ball of wax is
all
right
the
there.
bootlicking and the bootlicking, right? Because it's not only just about dominating those below you. It's also about worshiping those above you, right? And that is an important dichotomy, right? It's like you get your little place in the hierarchy, and you are the king of everyone below you, and you are the serf toward everyone above you. And you see this in this obsequious bootlicking we see from people like Mike Pence to Donald Trump, right? Like we see this all the time, and it's like I think at the Radical Secular, like, no, we don't worship anybody, right? And no one should be forced to worship anybody, right? If you want to worship God, go for it. But like, you don't force that on the rest of us.
Right. Forced worship, forced patriotism, etc. So that pretty much wraps up the section as to why we are radically secular and what the problems are that we are trying to solve. And so now we are going to go towards the positive side of this whole thing. And we're going to talk about how America should be, what we would have to do. And in order to implement our plan, our secret evil plan for reforming the country.
Yeah. Our evil plan to give everybody equal rights. Oh boy. And the only people for whom that sounds evil are people who are on the winning side of unequal rights, right? Like that, right? And that is everyone at the top of that hierarchy. Yep.
The Christian nationalists, white men, wealthy industrialists, Americans, rather than, just all the way on down the line. These are
all the way down the list.
The winners of a theocratic style of government. So in a secular America, this is a little bit redundant. We have to say it again. There should be no inequality under the law. All citizens are equal under the law. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment.
It's so wild that we have to say that, right? Like as if because that's a novel concept. If you are someone like Donald Trump, or if you are a wealthy person who thinks that you just because you're wealthy, you deserve special treatment, that you get to, and in America, in fact, you get it, right? You get to buy your way out of your problems. And the fact that we have to say that is an indictment, frankly, of how this entire system works.
Yeah. And this is the way the Constitution was written. Without the Bill of Rights, it would have been just pure feudalism.
Exactly.
And so the other thing that there should not be ever is a religious test for holding any public office. There are many states and cities right now where atheists are not allowed to hold public office according to the law. So that's got to go. And there is also a never-ending hostility toward atheists who make invocations in city council meetings, or even Muslims or Hindus who make invocations. It's just the Christians' heads explode that they're not the center of everything. So no religious test for public office. No use of public funds to promote religious activities. And this gets into a whole can of worms of private religious schools. It just goes on and on. No tax exemptions for churches. We could make a possible exception for churches who are engaging in charitable activity, and that was the original intent. But why? Why wouldn't the government be more efficient spending its own public funds as the taxpayers and the voters decide? Shouldn't that be the way it is?
Absolutely. And this actually gets back to a little bit what I was talking about earlier. It's like, just because churches have been doing something or have been the structure, it doesn't follow that it's the best way to do it or the fair way to do it. This is why, I think you can think about this in terms of how they had to do a Red Crescent, right? And not just a Red Cross, because it's like, no, actually that's offensive to Muslims, right? And hey, guess what? It's offensive to me. I don't want to have to go and get my help. If God forbid I needed it, God forbid. God forbid I needed it, right? I wouldn't want to have to go to a church to get it. I shouldn't have to do that as an American.
Right. And so, and this is the other thing they do is they want to take public funds for religious schools. And this is something public schools need to be officially secular. And this is an area of endless conflict that you hear. They're constantly talking about, oh, you took prayer out of schools. That's why kids are getting shot. We should have the 10 Commandments posted. We should have all these things. And it's just, you can't do it because that discriminates against people who are not Christians.
Exactly.
There shouldn't be the use of the word God on our currency, in the Pledge of Allegiance, on police cars, in schools, on license plates, state or national flags, or in courthouses. No religious displays on public property, such as the Ten Commandments, should be allowed. Now, to a lot of people, they have a problem with this because the word God is generic to all different religions. And this is technically true. But in America, the word God refers to the Christian God Yahweh. Now, Yahweh, as we know, in the Abrahamic religions is the same God as Allah. It's just a different translation. But you can imagine if our money said, "In Allah we trust." Can you imagine?
Can you imagine? Or even if anyone even suggested that, their political career would be over.
And, can you imagine if kids had to go to school and pledge allegiance, one nation under Allah? I mean, it's just...
I mean, the idea is laughable. Like, it's just like, no, that's never going to happen.
It's never going to happen. So it shouldn't be happening with Yahweh either. Mm-hmm. Gods should be not a part of our national compulsory dialogue because words matter.
Agreed.
Conscience clauses. This is another thing that's really important. Parents are using religious exemptions to avoid vaccination.
Mm-hmm.
Pharmacists are using conscience clauses to avoid filling birth control prescriptions. Bakers are using conscience clauses to avoid baking cakes for same-sex weddings. So that flies in the face of civil rights law, equal protection law. A business should serve all customers, and all employees should be hired equally. You shouldn't be able to fire someone for being gay. You shouldn't be able to not hire a gay person or anyone. No religious influence on rules for adoptions, marriages, births, and deaths. Religions can all observe their own customs voluntarily, but nobody else should be required to recognize those customs. Religions should have nothing to say about what types of civil marriages are considered legal by the state. If you don't want to marry a member of the different race or the same sex, then just say no if they ask you to marry them.
Exactly. No one's forcing you, right? No one's forcing you.
Yeah. I mean, a church or a mosque they're perfectly within their rights to refuse to perform a marriage ceremony that doesn't agree with their beliefs, but their members should not be allowed to prevent other churches or mosques or synagogues or non-religious celebrants from legally performing any marriages they choose that they believe.
Absolutely. And it's always just like, freedom of religion means, like this is one of these memes that flies around from time to time on certainly on, atheist Instagram. And it's just like, freedom of religion is like, I say that I don't eat, I don't eat fish. That's freedom of religion. That's different than saying that you can't eat, like, because of my religion, I don't eat fish. And then the opposite is, or the problem becomes when it's like, you can't eat fish because of my religion, right? And that's right. An important distinction there. And that's the problem with the whole religious liberty thing. It's like, it's affirmatively taking rights away from people because of an individual's religion. And that is deeply problematic. And what an end run around, frankly, brilliant end run around basic human rights and the Civil Rights Act, et cetera.
And we're going to see this really come to play in the next section where we're going to talk about schools, because schools are a flashpoint. And because they are public, they are for everyone, they are paid for by taxpayers. And so they're going to bring different religious kids into direct contact with one another. And that's the flashpoint. So we have to talk about that. But first, yes, let's discuss birth control and abortion. Abortion is their get out of jail free card. I mean, anything you want to talk about inequality or civil rights or injustice, they say, well, you kill babies.
It's the false premise,
And it's the same thing as with gay marriage. If it should be left up to the religious custom of each individual. If you don't believe in birth control, don't use it. If you don't believe in abortion, don't have one. A secular state should have no role in any woman's reproductive decisions. Period. Legal end-of-life decisions should be made in consultation with doctors only. We've seen the spectacle over the years of people being kept alive after they're brain dead. And I mean,
Terry Schiavo.
Terry Schiavo.
Oh my God. You remember that fucking saga? Jesus Christ. That's how I think Sean Hannity really vaunted into sort of fame around that. Like he was a huge advocate above that. Like I really think that really got him into the national spotlight, like out of his little corner of the world and into the national spotlight.
Yeah, I mean, and it doesn't even make sense because only religion with its incoherent concept of a soul would worry about keeping someone's body alive after they were clinically dead. It's absurd. And even worse than that, if you think about it, if you believe someone has an immortal soul, then dying isn't really dying. So
right.
Why would they care about what happens at the end of someone's earthly life? They're going to a heaven anyway. They're going to a better place.
Exactly. Shouldn't you be stoked about that? Come on,
Yeah, so Americans they're so used to granting privileges to the religious that everything I just talked about is super controversial. In fact, a lot of people just consider that it's plain rude to even talk about it and to question these religious privileges because of course they should have the right to do whatever they want and make everybody else do whatever they want. This is it. This is the crux of the right-wing argument. As one of their core principles, they believe that religious freedom itself depends on maintaining special privileges. Like you must say Merry Christmas. And if you say Happy Holidays, you are in a lower moral category.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so this is where we get into Alito. And this is a recent speech that he made just last week in front of the Federalist Society, which we can go on and on about that. But so here's what he says. He's really, really defending what he calls religious liberty. And he says, even before the pandemic, there was growing hostility to the expression of unfashionable views. And that too was a surprising development. Here's a marker. In 1972, the comedian George Carlin began to perform a routine called the 7 Dirty Words You Can't Say on TV. Today, you can see shows on your TV screen in which the dialogue appears at times to consist almost entirely of those words. Carlin's list seems like a quaint relic, but it would be easy to put together a new list called Things You Can't Say if you're a student or professor at a college or university, or an employee of many big corporations. And there wouldn't just be 7 items on that list. There would be 70 times 7. We would be closer to the mark. I won't go down the list, but I'll mention one that I've discussed in a published opinion. You can't say that marriage is the union between one man and one woman. Until very recently, that's what the vast majority of Americans thought. Now it's considered bigotry. That this would happen after our decision in Obergefell, which is the decision that Alito joined, or actually he dissented on Obergefell, right?
He dissented, yep.
Yeah. Should not have to come as a surprise. Yes, the opinion of the court included words meant to calm the fears of those who cling to traditional views on marriage. But I could see, and so did the other justices in dissent, where the decision would lead. We wrote the following, quote, I assume that those who cling to old beliefs will be able to whisper their thoughts in the recesses of their homes, but if they repeat those thoughts in public, they will risk being labeled as bigots and treated as such by governments, employers, and schools, end quote. That is just what's coming to pass. One of the great challenges for the Supreme Court going forward will be to protect freedom of speech. Although that freedom is falling out of favor in some circles, we need to do whatever we can to prevent it from becoming a second-tier constitutional right.
I don't even know what to say about that. Of course I know what to say about that. Fuck him. Fuck Samuel Alito. That is out because look, no one is saying he knows this. Right, the government, the amendments apply to restraining government action. Government action. The idea that that is such a conflation and deliberate conflation, right? Because look, you can say whatever you want. You are not shielded from the social consequences of your speech. It's the government can't put you in jail for saying, man, marriage is between one man and one woman. No government no American government, state, local, or national is going to do that. But private citizens, and by the way, this is the same guy who says corporations are people, right? Right. And meanwhile, he's like, oh, but corporations can't tell the people that work under them or can't set standards, right, about what bigotry means and what it doesn't mean. That it is astonishing. And also, same person who says it's all about corporate freedom, corporate power, corporations should be able to do whatever they want, and also that states are laboratories for different ideas. But as soon as an idea that he's not happy with, all of a sudden everyone it's so bad that people are being called bigots. Fuck you, Alito. Fuck you. That I read this when I read this outline earlier. And I just cannot, that this is coming from a Supreme Court justice is I know he's on his free time. He's not on the court, but look, what he says matters. What he says matters. And this portends what we will see from this court going forward and from this right-wing packed judiciary going forward.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, he quoted his decision. Part of that quote was in the decision, what he said. So this isn't just him ruminating in front of the Federalist Society. This is him talking about what he's going to do in the future. And the problem, they are so hypocritical and inconsistent about this. What he's really concerned about, he is so concerned that other Americans are using their free speech to call a religious bigot a bigot.
Exactly. And it's so infuriating. This is like the whole cancel culture thing and the Sam Harris argument and all this stuff. It's like, no one is restricted. We shouldn't tolerate your bigotry. We have no obligation to tolerate your bigotry, man. That's not what free speech means. That's not at all what free speech means, at least not under the Constitution.
He might as well be Archie fucking Bunker. I mean, he wants to go back to a time when all of American society was united in its bigotry, right? When it's like you say something like bigoted about a black person or a gay person or whatever, and all your friends are like, yeah, go, attaboy. You know?
You could say that in the boardroom. You could say that, right? You also why don't we just start slapping women on the ass in at work too, right? Oh, what are you, some sort of sexist? What are you fucking talking about? No, we've evolved. We're evolving as a culture. That's what's happening. And you're not happy about that, right? Honestly, infuriating. Absolutely infuriating.
And you know that Clarence Thomas, Amy Coney Barrett, possibly not Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh might be a little less sympathetic to this bullshit than we think. And same with Gorsuch.
Yeah, he's a little bit less of a hack than you would think. I'm sorry, I'm talking about Gorsuch now. Gorsuch, I think, is a little bit less of a hack than we thought of in the first instance. But because their arguments around the ACA this week were sounded like the people who follow the court very closely said it sounds like they're looking for reasons to uphold it, and that's remarkable. That's remarkable.
It's really remarkable, and so, I mean. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff because we're going long here, but it's just, I mean, he just whined and complained about these Christian pharmacy owners and bakery owners and this religious liberty stuff. It's just, it's a bottomless pit of bad faith. It's trying to drag America backwards. So, again, American conservative judicial philosophy exists. Its very basis of its existence is to protect American white, wealthy, Christian male business owners and to allow them to impose their will on everyone else in the world.
That's exactly right. I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more with that. The originalist concept, even just fundamentally, even if they really were originalists, which they're not, because they're perfectly willing to be activists. The perfect example is Scalia on the Second Amendment. That was the most activist interpretation of the Second Amendment that really changed and opened the floodgates to everybody being able to have whatever gun they want, right? And so they can be activists when they want to be, but even if they were really originalists, so like, wait, you were original to the original Constitution, right? So like, At what point do you call it original, right? Like
where's the cutoff?
Where's the cutoff? Where's the cutoff? Do you want to go back to before the amendments, right?
Yeah.
Right? Or was it at the or was it the 13th Amendment? That's where you draw the line. So it's such a bullshit argument, and like you say, it is absolutely about protecting unearned power. That's exactly what it is, Sean. That's exactly what it is.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about, I have a section here about what it costs us, what a religious tax exemption costs us. And I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. It's basically, $80 billion a year that we spend giving subsidies to churches.
Astonishing.
And that's $3 trillion over the past 40 years. I mean, if you want to know how much that is, I mean, we're getting up into what the Social Security Trust Fund is, that level of, I mean, can you imagine how many schools, hospitals could have been built with $3 trillion? How many children could have been fed? How many people could have been given health insurance? And, they use charity and volunteer work to justify this, but come on, who holds them accountable for spending their money on charity? We've seen all these examples of church leaders with mansions and sports cars and yachts and private jets. In 2018, it was this joke of a minister, Jesse Duplantis, said that God had told him to buy a Falcon 7X business jet for $54 million.
Of course, God. This sort of harks back to our earlier part of our discussion, right? If you're the only person who can talk to God, then God is whatever you want. Then God just says whatever you want, right? Come on,
including the fact that this was his fourth private jet. It wasn't his first; it was his fourth private jet. And his excuse was that Jesus wouldn't be riding a donkey. And in fact, Jesus did ride a donkey.
Right. Of all animals to choose, why did you choose a donkey? I mean, come on. That flies in the face of your exact doctrine, And look, here's the thing about these religious exemptions, man. And I'm really glad that you put the number on it, because I think a lot of people don't realize exactly what we're missing out on with these subsidies. And it'd be one thing if they really were doing purely religious stuff, but they're not, right?
Yeah.
They are acting as political. It's very clear what their political allegiance is, and right. So they are. If they were just completely silent about religion, about politics, maybe there'd be an argument there, but they're not. Of course, they're not.
Well, and this is just it. I mean, just to be clear, the $3 trillion figure is how much we've spent since 1980. And I take 1980. Sure. It's not a coincidence, because that's when Ronald Reagan got elected, and that's when all of this fuckery started with theocracy. So before that, they still got an exemption, but just maybe they were held a little bit more accountable for what they were doing with their money. And there is something in the tax code that says you can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a tax exempt organization, you cannot lobby, you cannot proselytize, right. and you cannot you can talk about issues, but you're not allowed to tell people how to vote. And let me tell you, a lot of church services all across our country are Republican political rallies.
Definitely. I mean, and that's exactly the point I'm making. We're making here, is that there is no light between the political, the right wing in this country and the religious right in this country. There is no light between them. They are one and the same. That's theocracy. That's fucking theocracy, man. That is fucking theocracy. And that's what they want to impose on the rest of us.
Yep. And so one entire political party is basically just corrupted. All right. Last section. One more thing to go through, and that is schools. What would it mean for schools to actually be radically secular? And this is huge. Schools have a huge influence on how the next generation of a society behaves, so it is especially important to make schools secular. And here is our modest proposal. In a public school environment, symbols of any culture or religion should remain limited to expressions of that culture's identity. In other words, there's no problem with a religious child wearing a cross or a star or a hijab or a yarmulke. Okay, because that is literally them saying, I'm Muslim, I'm Jewish, I'm atheist, I'm Christian, whatever. Okay, so there's no problem with symbols of identity, but such symbols should be subdued and must under no circumstances be allowed to attack another person's morals, ethics, or right to exist. In other words, you can say who you are, but you can't tell anybody else who they should be.
Yep. And this goes back to my fish analogy, right? Which is like, look, I get to say that because of my religion, I wear a yarmulke, but I don't get to say that you have to wear a cross because of my religion. Like that is an important distinction. And I shouldn't be able to walk into a school and say my shirts and with a shirt that says, marriage is between one man and one woman, right? For that same reason, because I am the gay people and the trans people and the non-binary people in that room in that school are being assaulted. They are being assaulted by that.
Well, right. And if you're a kid who comes in and you've got gay parents, legally
Yes.
married gay parents who adopted you, or maybe one of them had you. I mean, you could have, right? And so you come in and you see someone else displaying a shirt that says marriage is between a man and a woman. And you go, well, what about my parents?
Exactly. And by the way, that's going to affect everything about your life, right? We all know what it's like to be in school, to be in high school, especially, or middle school. For Christ's sake, middle school is awful, and all you want to do is fit in, right? And now you are being excluded from based on who you are and your life, and this is going to affect you. This will affect that kid and their grades and their experience and how they think of themselves. And I can talk about this in terms of being a person of color, right? I know what it's like to feel excluded. That we all know what it's like to feel excluded, but it's different to feel excluded based on who you are, right? And that has deleterious effects down the road for sure. I can attest to that. It does.
Yeah, and the whole way this starts, okay, is accusing someone from another culture of some sort of sin. And sin is a horrible word. It is the ultimate hate speech, because it means this is something that's not illegal, but it's something that a certain group wants to condemn anyway. And they want to write that condemnation into the law, right? Yeah. So if they wear that shirt to school that says marriage is between a man and a woman, what they're essentially saying is your parents shouldn't be allowed to be married and you shouldn't exist.
Exactly.
And so, why should somebody be condemned for their marriage that's not against the law? The answer is they shouldn't. And, setting up a separate category of sin is another attempt by the church to infiltrate the state. It's an attempt by religious groups to expand their influence outside of their own culture by universally condemning something as a sin. So it's a basic argument with the secular rule of law in favor of a so-called higher religious law. And they sneak it in.
Yep. That's right. Like I said earlier in our conversation, it's always like 1,000 paper cuts, right? It's over a long period of time. It's not just like all of a sudden. It's always slow and steady and persistent. Like that's what they're doing with abortions, what they've done with abortion, and this is what they're doing with secularism and tolerance, frankly.
Mm-hmm. So this is why we can't budge an inch on our objection to the posting of the 10 Commandments on public property, because this is where it all starts.
Yep.
The conservatives get those 10 Commandments put up, and pretty soon they're adding to it and making a whole other set of laws. So to clarify, by our standards in schools, secularism would have to allow face and body coverings, even though we think that sucks. We think that, we think it's a bad idea for girls to feel ashamed of their bodies. But at the same time, that is it's a lot of them won't go outside of their houses without their coverings. And so essentially, if you don't allow them to cover their faces, then you're excluding them from society. So as a secularist, you have to have some leniency for that, even though other people may think that it harms women's rights. And but the key here is, just like you don't let Christians wear that anti-gay marriage shirt, you don't let Muslims tell other girls that they are committing a sin by not wearing their face covering. And
exactly.
It's all a very fine line, because you've got people with different interests. Each of them thinks that they're right, and each of them thinks that they want to be in charge. But you have to walk that line. You have to prevent any group from oppressing any other group.
Yeah, you have to. I mean, you have to. It's just, you have to do that. And because in a pluralist society, and this gets back to, like, you cannot isolate yourself in the way our planet works, right? I mean, and ironically, capitalism is what drives that as a lot of what drives that synergy, that globalism, right? And because of that, when capital moves, labor moves, people move around, right? Climate change is only going to exacerbate that. So we have to find a way to live with each other, and that means we have to be, frankly, tolerant. And the only way that you're able to do that is for some either norms, but really laws, right? That make this sort of we have them. They're being circumvented, but we have these laws of the Civil Rights Act, right? These sort of these laws that, and the 14th Amendment, these laws that mean that everyone is equal under in the eyes of the law, and that's critical to a functioning democracy, to a functioning planet.
But it hasn't really been adjudicated, and this is they're still arguing over this whether free speech versus civil rights.
Yes.
And we wish that religion would get out of the culture business altogether, because we know that the world it's never going to be any less multicultural in the future than it is now. Like, it's just getting more multicultural all of the time.
Always.
And America is getting more multicultural. It's like when Van Jones said, our kindergarten looks like the United Nations. He's absolutely right. So as those kids go forward into secondary school and college and university, this is going to be the defining issue of the next, 5 to 10 to 20 years.
For sure.
As America becomes a majority minority nation. So, it's extremely controversial, because religious people who want to express these beliefs in a dominance hierarchy with their religion on top will often complain that secularists are imposing a reverse dominance hierarchy and oppressing them specifically, right? But we have to do it. We have to do it if we want to live together as a global civilization, like you said. And I mean, dominance hierarchies are left over from this primitive nationalistic culture where you only have one religion. And this is the paradox of tolerance. It's something we can't get away from.
Yeah. I mean, it really is. It really is. I mean, they're like, and this is where the libertarian says, "Oh, we don't need rules," but we obviously do. We obviously do, because if without them, one dominant culture, anything, a culture, person, company, right, from Amazon to Christianity to whatever, will then end up dominating those below it, and like, you can't run a functioning society like that. Set aside the moral arguments, just as a practical matter, you cannot run a society like that in the long term. You just can't. You end up being Iran. You end up being right Afghanistan. You end up right. This is where you end up, and no one really wants to live there. And this is what happens.
Right,
Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, and increasingly America is trending in that direction. And so in order to combat this, we have to have some courage, because in the end, to achieve fairness to the individual, we have to paradoxically treat artificial hierarchies and those who embrace them in a manner that they would consider to be unfair. And I don't know how you resolve this conflict, because they're just going to insist that, we're terrible, that we're the oppressors, and they just turn it all around.
It's like a reverse racism thing, right? The idea of reverse racism is like, oh, no, you're being the racist because you are talking about racism, right? Or you are confronting racism. It's this whole, and Trumpism is the crystallization of that kind of victimhood, this idea that like, oh my God, if there's any restraints, if I have to consider other people at all, then you are oppressing me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it just makes your head explode. And we're going to have to be willing to defend equality against even the accusation of intolerance, because hierarchy, it's just that kind of beast. It's the enemy of human freedom. It always has been. It always will be. And to bastardize an old cliche, eternal vigilance against hierarchy is the price of equality.
Yep.
And that's all I got. I don't know if you have any final thoughts.
I don't, man. But it's other than to say it's been, I think, a really important conversation. If you're a listener and you've gotten to this level point, and you're listening, thank you. And because we're gonna reference this podcast this episode a lot, because it's really important that people understand what we're about, what we're against, what we're advocating, and why we think it's so critical to a continuing functioning democracy. And importantly, that it's not just enough, right, to say like, oh yeah, well, hey, well, it's okay as long as religious people are as long as I'm okay, or as long as it doesn't become it remains at the fringes. But those fringes have sort of made their way into the mainstream, and we are facing a real threat of theocracy here. And we are, the radical secular here is hopefully the beginning, igniting the fire of a movement, and proposing alternatives to that old structure. So, Sean, thanks so much. I know you've done so much research on this, and it's been a fucking fantastic conversation. And that's all I've got.
Oh, thank you, man. Well, it was fun to do, and I love it because this is passionate about this subject. So, once again, I want to remind you to make sure and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to hit that red subscribe button, and be sure to give us a 5-star rating on your podcast host, and write us a review over at Apple. Positive podcast reviews at Apple will help us grow in their recommendations list faster than almost anything else. And tell your friends and family about our show. Word of mouth really matters. Look, thanks everyone for being here. And remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.